All right, I am now joined by Jesse Singal, who is the host of the Blocked and Reported podcast, and along with Katie Herzog, and is also the author of the book that we are going to be talking about today, which actually just came out today officially. So it's called The Quick Fix: Why Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills. So what the hell, it can't? Why not?
It's a long story, but I want to first of all apologize for my haggard appearance. I didn't realize I looked so bad until I got on the camera. Also, just quick side note before we begin, I saw on Twitter earlier today that you have the exact same politics as Dave Rubin. So I'm not sure I should be platforming you. I'm very ashamed of this.
Yeah. Well, I would object to your use of the word platforming, except that I have it's not original to you. Like, this is something that I've been accused of various times, is platforming people when I go on their platforms. So I think there's been some interesting semantic drift, in what platforming means.
Just a little bit. No, thank you for having me on, though. I appreciate it.
Yeah. That did come up. So this was in the context of a tweet about what I think is my most widely reviled take that I've had in a long time, which is that Blade Runner 2049 wasn't a very good movie, and
that makes you Dave Rubin to say an obviously like aesthetically grabby but pretty empty movie was bad. That you're Dave Rubin now?
Okay, well, there are a couple of links between that and why I'm Dave Rubin. So I posted this. I said, it's been long enough that we can just admit that as good as it looked, right? Like it actually wasn't a very good movie. And there was there's a lot of pushback about that. Although I will note that the tweet had more likes than comments, which I believe by the laws of Twitter means that I'm right. I think that's the rule.
Those are the rules.
Yeah. And so somebody, I made a sort of jokey tweet saying this, that, look, I wasn't ratioed, so I was right about this. And somebody, commented in a, jokey, good spirited way to say, this is actually, you're actually so wrong about this. I have no choice but to, defect from your side of the political spectrum and become a Dave Rubin fan. And I quote tweeted that and said, tough but fair. Then I had somebody say, yeah, you joke, but like you basically are like Dave Rubin, which I thought was interesting because last I checked, I'm somebody who, supports, abortion rights and trans equality. And I supported the, anti-police brutality protests last summer, and I campaigned for Bernie Sanders, and I held my nose in my swing state and voted for Joe Biden to stop Trump, and and then immediately started criticizing the Biden administration for the left. And last I checked, Dave Rubin voted for Trump and is like increasingly socially conservative, and I'd also like to think that the fact that Dave Rubin is an idiot is a disanalogy, but I guess that's more subjective.
Hey man, you got to fight those SJWs, even when it makes you vote for Trump. What can you say?
Yeah. That was the Yeah, no, that is some amazing reasoning, by the way. Like off topic, but just like that, people like Dave Rubin said, like even like this, the best version of this position, right? Like the sort of people who are a little bit more articulate than Dave Rubin was like, okay, we're sick of people getting too upset at us over culture war things. So clearly the solution to this, the way to calm the waters, is for Donald Trump to be president for another 4 years.
Right. Is to reelect the guy who single-handedly shifted us most in a direction of just like total cultural hysteria on every front. Yeah, that'll help.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Katie and I had talked about this on our podcast, and I don't want to be too off topic, but we had a few people, our listeners are overwhelmingly liberal, with some conservatives thrown in, but a few people tried to make that argument or were sympathetic to like the James Lindsay version of it. And we did not like that. That's, I don't know, man. There's just so many differences between the two. Even for you, someone who's far to the left of me, policy-wise, there are massive differences. Even if this tactical idea that Trump is going to be an effective opponent of wokeism rather than just exacerbate it, I thought that was such a silly idea. So,
yeah, well, and it's also so that's one thing, right? That like clearly Trump, was a lightning rod for like raising the temperature on everything all the time. That's what he did. Mm-hmm. And there's also like, okay, so there are lots of things that, that we talk about when we use this sort of vague category of wokeness, and some of them are very irritating to me, but like also at the core of a lot of it is some vaguely socially progressive instinct about equality and anti-discrimination and good things like that. And like that actually, just being a bigot like Trump actually does strike me as worse than that. Like I would rather have somebody who is sort of on the right side of a lot of things and is kind of annoying and counterproductive about some of it than somebody who is like just flagrantly on the side of bad things, like that strike me as a very hard call.
I think some lefties ended up, not lefties, more radlibs ended up overestimating how much of an aberration Trump was and how much damage he could do and all that. You can hold that in your head and also realize that his vision for America was completely at odds with the vision of America held by everyone who's left of center. I mean, just Stephen Miller alone should tell us that, to put someone like that in a position of power. So I just,
yeah, right. So it's like, I mean, I definitely agree with the first part that there were definitely lots of liberals who drastically overstated how much of an aberration Trump was. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think that like, in most ways, I think Trump was certainly more erratic and more openly racist, but I think he was also like, I think a lot of the bad things that he did, like I think that like, Mitt Romney would have done, like I think that's true. So like there's a sort of something that a lot of MSNBC viewers and never Trump Republicans for that matter, like believed about that I don't think really holds up. But it's also the case that, being erratic and openly racist is bad. And also that just like, whatever, see above how, the sort of differences between my long-term political goals and Dave Rubin's, that I would like to have, workers control the means of production, and Dave Rubin voted for Donald Trump. That I think that it's also the case that, like, okay, even to the extent that Trump was just a regular Republican, regular Republicans are pretty bad, right? Like they. I mean,
I think they're economically far right by the standards of most industrialized countries, and I think one of my issues is Trump was uniquely dangerous in certain elements of how erratic he was and how openly he would just be like, yeah, ban the Muslims, whatever. I mean, that shit is genuinely dangerous. But the economic policy has always been horrific. The George W. Bush tax policy was horrific. And it's so not grabby and sexy to talk about tax brackets and who gets what. But in the long run, that stuff is actually much more important. In terms of the damage done to the lives lost, that stuff actually matters much more than even horrible policies like the Muslim ban. It just does.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That and also appointing hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board, and really rolling back a lot of previous NLRB precedents, in ways that made it much harder for working people to organize for better wages and benefits, and also, right, like having appointing hardcore social conservatives to various courts, including the Supreme Court, I think is a very bad thing, because going back to the point about wokeness, if there's one thing that I dislike more than somebody who is annoying and is obsessed with the culture war, but basically has some socially progressive instincts, even if they're sometimes channeled in confused or annoying ways, it's somebody who's obsessed with the culture war and has basically reactionary bad impulses.
Yeah.
Like that seems like a worse version of that. But certainly from the perspective, I should say, for people who aren't familiar with him, you can listen to me talking to Jesse on Blocked and Reported last June, something like that.
Yeah,
it's
crazy,
June.
but yeah, I think it was June.
Yeah, and in that, we do, towards the end, we do argue about socialism just a little bit.
You should give me credit. I gave you a chance to convert me to socialism in, I think, 45 seconds, and you failed. So
yeah, fair enough.
You got wrecked.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I can still hold my head up doing this, but but yeah, I think that sometimes, for kind of the sake of fucking around and self-deprecation, I think you might sort of exaggerate your shitlibism. I think that my read at least is that basically, you're a good social democrat. You want there to be national health care and stuff like that. You just you're just not on board about the sort of more radical, long-term goals that socialists have.
I also think I'm very attendant to how rigged the game is, and I think the Obamacare fight. Not that I'm a policy wonk, but it had a pretty big impact on me to see the widespread conservative freakout and oftentimes crazy corporate resistance to a center right healthcare policy. So that's why when I see leftists say we should pursue real nationalized healthcare, I'm I would love to be able to pull a lever to do that, but going into that fight, you need to make sure that it's not going to generate horrific backlash and make sure you actually know how to wage that fight. And I do think there's something to this liberal theory of the Green Lantern theory, that if you just frame it the right way, you can overcome all these sort of forms of structural opposition. So that, I think, it's basically just a lot of divides on the left have to do with how pragmatic you are. And I think people can sometimes use pragmatism as an ideological fig leaf because they don't actually want national health care. So they just say, well, we could never get it. I would love to have it, but I also think it's unlikely in the present context we could get it.
Yeah. So, I think that the thing that always bothers me about that Green Lanternism explanation, accusation, is that it always seems like during election years, liberals believe that the presidency has tons of power to shape what happens legislatively and to influence the direction of things. And then and they also think that Republicans are in power, but when Democrats are in power, they're they become extremely basically they start to think that the president is powerless, and if you think otherwise, you're doing Green Lanternism. None of which is to say that I think that if Bernie Sanders had become president, we would have had Medicare for all by the next midterms or something, or maybe even during his presidency, because I think it's an incredibly difficult political battle that does have tons of very powerful and deeply rooted opposition, that has to be overcome. But the point about policy goals is just to say that whereas I do take your point, right? I think there probably is a difference in in temperament, that I sort of start twitching when I hear people praising Elizabeth Warren, and I know you don't feel that way, but I think but but I think that there is, in terms of what used to be called, like in the Second International, the minimum program, like the things that the left would like in the short term. I think you are on board with a lot of that, and I think that there is a reason, and that like the book that the quick fix, it's not mostly about policy, but I think that there is like I think, and there are parts of it where you gesture at this. Now I should say, I haven't read the entirety of it yet. It's possible there's a part I haven't gotten to yet where you advocate genocide or something, in which case...
second to last chapter, yeah.
Second to last chapter, okay.
The case for genocide. It's right in the title.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I really should have looked at the table of contents before this interview, but so if that's there, I disown it in advance. But what I've looked at, even though most of it, even though it's not directly about policy, it is in a way about the way that there is a lot of sort of faddish thinking and bad science that is used as a sort of excuse not to think about structural problems like, poverty and structural racism and things like that, that could that like what it would actually take to do anything about this would be, massive redistribution, at the very least, massive redistribution of wealth. And you have all of these people, and sometimes there's a kind of like woke flavor into this, although sometimes it's more politically ecumenical, who think that these things can be solved by this is going to be a little bit of a caricature, but then in your usual earnest way, you can give me the more nuanced version, can be solved by, like, for example, having middle-class white people take implicit bias tests and do, have vision quests about their personal racism, right. or having, or actually the thing that's still, or just like teaching people to be more assertive, so they can climb up the class ladder, or to have, and this is the actual term they use, more grit.
Yep, gotta have grit.
Yeah, which sounds like something that like your sort of like dumb right wing uncle would say at a family gathering. It's like, look, people just need to have more grit. And
yeah.
Like they'll be able to get out of these circumstances.
Well, that's what's so interesting, and I'm more kind of pieced about this actually. But there's like the overlap between these ideas, which are supposedly cutting edge social psychology, that are often presented in a novel and counterintuitive way. But then when you like really look into them, you're like, this is self-help. It's like stand up straight, have more grit, try harder. So there's this weird adulteration or repackaging going on, and that's what I'm trying to get out of the book, or one of the things I'm trying to get at, other than being pro-genocide.
Right. So like in the self-esteem point, you point out that some of this actually comes from the work of Ayn Rand's one-time paramour and ideological comrade, Nathaniel Branden.
Yeah. So he wrote a best-selling book about self-esteem that some of its insights found their way to a guy named John Vasconcellos, who was a California state assemblyman. And in the 80s, he convinced the governor of California. This guy was like sort of a spiritual seeker. He had different fads along the way. Said some disturbing things about pedophilia and incest, which he was soft on, I would say. He became convinced that self-esteem, or a lack of it, was the root of all these social ills. And he convinced the governor of California to give him, I think, $300,000 a year to run a commission to study this problem. And sure enough, they discovered, by grossly distorting the evidence, that self-esteem can fix everything. Criminals were criminals because their self-esteem was too low. Low-achieving students didn't have enough self-esteem, and this became a nationwide craze. It actually spread to other countries too. But I think we're similar ages. We're both like 22, 23, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. I think we both grew up having some exposure probably to these self-esteem curricula. Sure. And there's very little there. There's very little evidence to suggest that self-esteem plays a causal role in generating good outcomes. One thing that I love is that for a long time, people talked about an American epidemic of low self-esteem, but no country is more full of themselves than Americans. We have our self-esteem is off the charts. If anything, the problem is in the other direction. So yeah, that's one of the trends I talk about. And as in the other ideas in the book, like you see how this sort of distracts attention from actual issues, like the reason for crime, the reason for education gaps. There's always like this shiny thing you can reach for to fix them that doesn't actually involve any sort of like meaningful or structural reform.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really like I mean, you can see why Nathaniel Branden, would think so, because this is perfect for his view of the world, that it's actually that that altruism is bad. You just you need to you only need to care about yourself, and that's fine, that's enough. In fact, not only do we not need some people to sacrifice, for the sake of others? If everybody was just into themselves enough, then then we wouldn't have, crime and, poverty and these different social ills.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, that sort of same thing with power posing. That's the idea. If you hold these like assertive poses, you'll become more confident and assertive in the workplace. Where again, it's this very like every person for themselves. Everyone has to optimize their own abilities, and it just misses all. With that idea, it's commonly associated with the gender gap. And so this is Amy Cuddy, social psychologist at Harvard Business School, who it fit perfectly in with lean-in feminism, which is basically telling women to act more stereotypically masculine to address these gender gaps that are caused by very specific things that aren't really a lack of acting masculine. It's more complicated than that. So yeah, it's just self-help and sort of individualism throughout, which is, for social psychology, which is a field that should deal with social structures in a serious way, it's a shortcoming, I would argue.
Yeah, you definitely think so. And it's also like, this is an explanation of, and it's weird too, because like this, even though it's often presented in, feminist packaging, this is an explanation of gender economic inequality that is in a weird way, like completely lets guys off the hook, right? It's not about anything that's done to women, right? It's about, women just not, going for it enough, not leaning in sufficiently, which yeah.
Yeah, there's these examples from Sheryl Sandberg's book. One of them that I loved was at Harvard Business School, at least when she was there, professors weren't allowed to take notes during class, but then class participation was a big part of grades. So you could see how that would benefit bullshit artists who could just like stand up and make confident sounding points. But if you're more, introverted or more cautious, you would get punished for that. And I feel like the reaction of sort of Sandberg and Cuddy to those sorts of structures isn't, why don't we change the rules? It's more like, oh yeah, women should act more confident. They should get up and make confident declarative statements, which to me is sort of missing the point, because we should want business school to not incentivize dumb bullshit artistry.
Yeah, and there's also like a lot of things that so yes, that's one thing that, like, to the extent that that what you're that what you're concerned with, the sort of locus of concern about gender inequality and economic outcomes is about women not doing well enough in business school, then it seems like, sure, they should be more fair in how they evaluate students, not the other way around. But also, of course, there are a lot of one thing that I think a lot of conservatives like to emphasize, although they're not totally wrong about the premise, although I think that they take it in a really ridiculous way, is that like a lot of gender wage gap, for example, does come out of women taking time off from like when they have children, and like not and being at a disadvantage.
Which is, I mean, that they're right. I mean, that's not the only thing, but that is a bigger factor than the idea that men and women are paid different amounts for the exact same work. But that's the answer to that is structural. It's paid parental leave or childcare, or making it easier for women to sort of there's just a point I make in the book. There's actually a good Vox article about this, that where in the world of pharmacy, it doesn't really matter who is fulfilling your prescription, whether it's your usual pharmacist or a different one. And that actually makes it easier for women to take some time off without really getting punished. Whereas in legal settings, it's like you're a lawyer. You have to work with your lawyer. They're familiar with your case. So one potential intervention is to make work sort of more substitutable. That's not the only answer, but that's a more complicated fix than just be more assertive, just seize the opportunities that come to you. That's sort of empty or platitudinous.
No, for sure, and yeah, I think that I think that universal, free, daycare, would go. It's not a cure-all, but I mean, it would go a long way towards solving this problem.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think that it's actually kind of, I support free college, but I also think it's kind of bad and kind of telling that the left spends so much more time talking about like free college than free daycare, since they're
man. Are you suggesting class is important to people's priorities?
Yeah, that like people, that like largely speaking, right, like the social base of even the socialist left right now are, downwardly mobile, educated professionals or children of educated professionals who are, overwhelmingly likely to have at least gone to college. And so they're more likely to think about that and be attuned to it and get worked up about that than about like, daycare, yeah.
A subtly important moment for me in understanding how this class stuff works was when I got in these very dumb Twitter fights with people who thought a major source for the worldwide resurgence in anti-Semitism was South Park. It's just like the sort of person who looks out at the world and who decides South Park is the problem is someone who has a lot of free time to consume pop culture. And that might explain the lens through which they analyze the world.
Yeah. So they also, I guess this might undermine my claim earlier to be 22 or 23, but having grown up watching quite a bit of South Park, I always got the impression that like the fat, disgusting sociopath who was frequently seen, doing like explicitly Nazi things, and
Right.
and like that the show didn't admire him, that he wasn't being held up as a role model.
Yes. Unfortunately, people seem to have forgotten basic aspects of sort of literary analysis. And if a character does a bad thing, that means the creators support that bad thing. I've learned this from my run-ins with young adult fiction Twitter. So the rules are different now.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, why would you put a character in a story who did a bad thing if you didn't actually support that bad thing? Like that's clearly how fiction works.
Mm-hmm. If I ever write fiction, it's just going to be page after page of characters denouncing racism, but in stronger and stronger terms.
Yes. Well, I mean, that would be a compelling story. I'm sure we'd all like to read that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think there is like something interesting there. I mean, beyond like, okay, yes, I mean the deep stupidity of these examples, but like there's also like a more general thing, which is that there is this fixation on strange symbolic battles that you like, that you can't help wondering at a certain point how much of it comes from a calculation that like larger substantive battles are unwinnable or intractable. That like if you have when there were the mass protests against police violence last summer, presumably the primary initial goal of most people protesting was to at the very least have some sort of reforms to the way that policing works, make police departments less militarized, have like try to do things that would change the balance of power between police and ordinary people, and make it harder for police to get away with abusive or violent behavior. But it's not like so much of what actually happened at the level like the pettiest possible symbolism, like, because and you don't have to say that symbolism is completely unimportant, right?
Yeah.
Like to make this case, right? Like, I think that if you have like a statue of like some 19th century supervillain like Robert E. Lee in your town, you should take down the statue. But also, it is telling that in so much of that progression, people sort of went from, let's remove the most obviously egregious statues, to let's remove some sort of gray area statues, to let's remove some statues that actually don't seem very objectionable. Like, because it's a kind of like, it really feels to me like a search for winnable symbolic battles.
Well, can I take your warm take, and I'll call your warm take and raise you a hot take? Is that okay? I'm halfway through. What are you drinking, by the way?
Oh, it's a Bell's Oberon.
Nice.
It's a nice. It's a good Michigan beer.
I'm halfway through a whiskey ginger, very masculine drink, and I'm willing to do a take that's pretty hot and will maybe get me a little in trouble. But I think piggyback off what you're talking about.
Yeah, your Hemingways and your Bukowskis never drank whiskey without ginger in it.
No. I mean, I'm a better writer than them. I just have different drinking habits. Okay. On the police thing, this is my hottest take on this.
Okay, go for it.
Every day, people are thrown into jail over bullshit, over littering, over loitering. The New York Times did some good coverage of this. Kid puts his foot up on the subway seat and is in jail, and you lose your job because you can't get out, you can't get bail. People getting shot while unarmed, it's horrible. It's like the worst thing imaginable. It's not that common. It's not like the kind of thing that a black person or a poor person faces every day just walking the streets in a poor neighborhood, whereas they do face these other outcomes. I think to privileged white liberals, like, we get drawn to the stuff that we have the most access to. Like, we can watch the video and get outraged by it, and we determine that this is like really the thing. And you see way more attention. Obviously, this is important. We need better crisis counselors. We need ways to de-escalate situations with mentally ill people. That stuff's important. But like basic shit like the public defender system or reforming certain laws where people can be arrested over nothing, I feel like they get disproportionately less attention, because I do think there's this class thing where, like, whatever the people who are the most online about are most affected by, and these videos are horrible, undeniably, I think it sometimes gets disproportionately more attention. And I'm worried there's also like a political cost to that, because like there aren't that many cases, honestly, of things like, George Floyd, where it's just so obviously egregiously terrible. Like, the Washington Post keeps amazing statistics on this, and there aren't that many unarmed people in a country of 330 million people who get killed in that horrible manner. It's much more common that it's this subtler thing where someone's life gets ruined over a bullshit charge. And I just wish we could pay more attention to that. That's the hottest take I'll give on this stream.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So goodbye, Jesse. No, I think, sure. I mean, I think that I think that some of the egregiousness of that doesn't come from frequency necessarily. It comes from sort of the impunity, right? Like if you if you if you killed one person tomorrow, like just you saw them on the street New York, and you killed them, and you didn't kill another person for another 2 years, then like being killed by Jesse Singal would be like a very like relatively like low level concern.
And I hope people don't find out what I did on that front.
Yeah, but if you did it and it was on tape, and then you weren't arrested, and Katie was still willing to do the podcast with you, and right. Et cetera, right? Then I think that would be a disturbing issue, which is not to say that it's like it's the main, I think that it is plausible, that like it's a extremely disturbing sign of a general power imbalance between people most likely to be on the receiving end of the most like brutal and militarized forms of law enforcement, that like most of the symptoms that do the most harm are lower level than that, right? I think that's consistent.
Well, just to contradict myself, I mean, I was reminded that like even the Tamir Rice case, which is like one of the most egregious you'll ever see, there were no charges there. So I can understand, obviously, a kid is murdered over nothing and there's no accountability. So I can understand that. I just think like, I don't know, maybe it sort of goes back to the argument of my book where it's like in terms of how much good you can do, I want there to be crisis de-escalation. I want cops to be better in situations like that. But I don't know. I'm more confident about moving the needle. Like in New York, we reformed the law so that a lot of like low level offenses, public drinking, public urinating, are civil offenses. Now you get a civil summons. I just think that kind of stuff, sometimes we should focus more on it than we do.
No, that's fair. I mean, I think that sure. I mean, it's certainly the case that there are a lot of things that, cops are empowered to hassle people over that could be, effectively decriminalized, and that, and that people would then have, I think having fewer encounters with between the police and the public would go, I mean, it would even go a certain way towards solving, this problem because there'd be less ways that this can come up, right? Which is something that we saw, like, from a different perspective, right? When you had like police union officials complaining about, marijuana being, recreationally, legalized by saying, but now we can't like pull people over because we smell weed, like, which is
right. Poor guys.
Which would be a very good thing for many reasons, including the fact that every now and again somebody does end up dead, for no fault of their own in those encounters.
Yeah.
I will also say, I mean, I don't think it could be a complete solution because, like in some of these cases, like people are being pulled over or stopped or talked to for things that, like, I don't think anybody particularly thinks should be legalized, right? That like, like they're accused, like they have, they have a, brake light out or something. And whereas like the, appropriate response might just be like, hey, do you know you have a brake light out? Okay, I'll see you. Like it's also the case that like, okay, I don't know, anybody seriously thinks that, it should just be fine. You can just drive, without working brakes or,
right.
People, or, somebody is stopped because they're a suspect in like a strong armed robbery. Obviously we're not going to legalize robbery, but that shouldn't end up with somebody being dead.
Yes.
And so there's a, so I think that you need to do a range of things, and that minimizing.
Well, I also just think like so many people, and I'm including myself and my very white direct immediate family members in this. So many people have had deeply abusive interactions with cops of every way that don't rise to the level of them shooting us, but just clear abuses of power. So it would obviously be nice if there were some safeguards in place. So if a cop does pull you over just for a broken taillight, maybe they don't have the power to search your car for no reason or to contrive some bullshit probable cause. I mean, it just, I don't know, just even based on stuff from my own family, like there's room there for a lot of improvement. And I can't imagine what people who look different from us go through every day.
Yeah, no, exactly. And significantly though, right, to pull it back to where we were, it's not actually going to help that in any way, right? To do the kinds of symbolic things that people often ended up being very concerned with, right? So like, for example, I knew, there's a friend of mine who lives in Brooklyn and podcasts for a living, which narrows it down to like 500 people, and who I remember telling me last summer that there were people who were like bombarding the Facebook page of his like neighborhood beer bar with like anger about the fact that they hadn't issued a statement of support, for Black Lives Matter and the protests.
Mm-hmm.
Now they also hadn't used their Facebook page since the pandemic started, since they'd like shut down most of their operations. That's a, kind of a silly example, but it's, and, there's something I heard you talk about in your show where there was somebody at a
climbing gym. This was awesome.
Yes, a climbing gym who somebody like the climbing gym made a statement about racism, since I'm sure everybody is waiting to hear from the climbing gym on this, like that's what's gonna, like really move the needle on this, is when the climate, the climbing gym speak, puts itself squarely on the side of racial justice, and somebody had like I don't know what was it, like Instagram, what
he
was
just
the
on
form of
Facebook, he
comment?
was just like, guys, this is silly posturing. The Long Island City Cliffs climbing gym is not a center of white supremacy.
Yeah, right. I think the statement had like said like more platitudes, please.
Yeah.
And he was like kicked out. He was banned
He
from.
was banned from from all their 3 New York City area climbing gyms. It was awesome.
Yeah, and because people were unsafe, because he posted it,
Yep.
which and and I think that there is like there's an interesting question there about what makes people like this, that they're going to sort of like pour their energy into these kinds of battles to like stop the like dangerously sarcastic person from working out at the climbing gym. That, and it seems like part of it is just that like if you can't do the things that would actually matter, right? Like even the sort of things that would like it's very difficult to get to get it to be the case that police departments can't have military equipment, or that like there's like some sort of review board that's actually empowered to fire people, or reforms like this.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to kick somebody out of a climbing gym. And so if you can't do the hard thing, you can at least do the easy thing. And I think that's I don't think it's a full explanation, but I think that's at least part of how people end up deciding that like this is the hill they're going to die on.
Well, can I derail our conversation even further and show an article I just wrote that gives an even better example? I had started writing this for a major outlet that isn't Reason. I ended up publishing it in Reason. It went up yesterday. Lake Washington Community College outside Seattle. They did a Robin DiAngelo training, a mandatory segregated diversity training, because when you want to improve racial unity, you chop people up by race.
Well, obviously, yeah.
As one does. Right now, this is an all-white interaction between you and me. Although we're Jewish, so we're white adjacent, I guess. This sort of awkward professor with weird politics, she voted for Jill Stein and then Donald Trump last summer. During this training over Zoom, she decided to do a 5-minute statement about how she disagreed with mandatory segregated diversity trainings. So she gave this little thing. It read like a David Brooks column, nothing radical, just like we focus too much on race. This is too divisive. We shouldn't accuse people of racism without being sure. Bog standard responses to Robin DiAngelo. As I reported in this piece that went up on Reason yesterday, her college responded by spending 9 months and probably $250,000 investigating her for her remarks. And this is a really good example of how within these institutions, people seem to not have any belief in their ability to actually improve the world. So they'll just sort of purge their local social environment of wrong thinkers, often at great cost and often like in a very authoritarian way. So I think there's something. Well, I was
going to say at great cost to labor rights. I mean, this is actually a tenured community college professor, who works for a public institution. So she has legal protections that like it would, unfortunately, right, most people work at places where they can be fired, for their political speech, but public employees legally can't be. So that the whole thing is something that if you care about, about workers' rights, about, constitutional protections, is disturbing on that level. It's also just a weird waste of everybody's resources. Like I like this person had. In fact, they asked the trainer, the white fragility trainer, if they could read the statement. They said sure, or they said there's something I want to say, because this is a time I can say it. The person said sure. They went on for like 4 minutes, and whatever. Like this is, as you say, it's not a perfect victim. They seem like kind of a weirdo, and
they also went to the Stop the Steal rally, but that was later on. That's why the mainstream outlet I was writing for spiked it, and I went to read. Not that there's, I actually think Reason is good on some of these issues where I no longer trust mainstream publications just to take reasonable stances. But yeah, no, just it was a crazy story, and it was weird to me. I watched actual lefty academics defending this like egregious abuse, labor abuse. As you say, that's what it is. And I feel like people have no principles on this stuff, and they immediately jump to the side of management as soon as there's any whiff of wrongthink, which I find so fucking disturbing, to be honest.
No, exactly. Like this thing, yeah. I mean, like that you have that she asked if she could say this, and again, I could believe, given this person who this person is, that is like some weird Jill Stein, Donald Trump swing voter. That like I could believe that in various ways she was tone deaf or annoying, but like she had, she asked if she could say this. The trainer said yes. She went on for like 4 minutes. And the trainer said, "Okay, that's it, right? I mean, we're gonna wrap. We're gonna stop this now." And then she sort of barreled her way through like an extra minute of it. Yeah, and exactly. So the offense would be if it's not the content of it, right? And the content of it, right? It's not like she was saying some like wildly racist things. She was saying she objected to the training, which many people do for many reasons, but they like, she said, and so if it's not the content, right, it's the offense is that she continued speaking, for about a minute after she was supposed to, which doesn't seem like as like things that people can do as gestures of protest go, right? Like if you think about the range of protest activities that happen on college campuses, like this is a pretty mild violation of the rules.
Nothing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, people, like people do for the sake of protesting. They'll lie down in the doors of places they're not supposed to be and get hauled out by college security, etc. And we don't normally, like see these things as very big deals. And like, even if you think, okay, well, whatever, you're probably going to pay some sort of penalty for this, right? If you got several months of investigation and you're suspended from your job during those months, I think that in a different context, if you were protesting something else, we would see this as like a serious problem, as like a really like authoritarian, disturbing response, by a college to a protest.
Yeah. It was, I don't know what made me think of that, but I just, it ties into this broader thing of like people who claim to be ardent supporters of racial justice or social reform, just focusing on the most ridiculous bullshit rather than, I mean, a community college can do a lot of good with, we don't know exactly how much it costs. $250,000, I think, is a reasonable estimate. That's a lot of tuition. That's a lot of like technical vocational training. And you're spending that investigating your fucking tenured instructor for a 4 minute. This was a crazy story.
Yeah. You could probably, also, I've got to say, given my own background, the first thing that jumps into my mind is you could give a few adjuncts full-time contracts and health insurance. But maybe not the highest priority, but it would be a better thing to do with the money. So the subject of the actual trainings like does take us back to the book, though, because this is this idea that the way that you achieve racial equity is by having people figure out what their unconscious biases are and go through some sort of process of spiritual transformation about it, is kind of the underlying theory of the Robin DiAngelo trainings. And it's something that you critique in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think my main thing is like Park Slope liberals or suburban leafy Boston suburb where I'm from liberals. It doesn't seem like the main problem is we have the wrong beliefs on race. We can recite all the platitudes. Everyone from the town where I grew up would tell you we live in a white supremacist country and white people need to do better. White people need to listen to black people. When push comes to shove, that doesn't seem to lead us to like not move to cities where, our property tax dollars let us build incredible gleaming new high schools or to really do much to fight residential segregation. Like, Western. I don't want to name names. There's a very wealthy Boston suburbs embroiled in a brutal fight over like some potential affordable housing in a small wealthy town that has none. And I'm jaded about all these performative gestures. So like, I took the IAT. I can't believe my result, the implicit association test. I read Robin DiAngelo. I was so moved by understanding my own racism. And it doesn't seem to lead people to do anything but to get weirder and weirder. And often I'd argue less capable of actually interacting interpersonally with Black people. I think this is like a belief system.
Yeah. So, well, I think given your interest, it's a certainty that you know who this is, but Sarah, how do you say her name? Rao?
Shira Rao, yeah.
Yeah. I saw posted the other day that if you're a white person and if your Black and brown friends aren't challenging your whiteness, then believe me that they are to, like behind your back, they're just not doing it, to you.
What's amazing about that is like, there's such a difference between the sort of Black person who gets to write in the New York Times and say things like that versus the average Black person who, I promise you, when they interact with white people, they're not thinking like, oh, I just want to challenge their white. It's just this presumption that this very rarefied language that you really only find in like college settings and elite newsrooms, that's what these big racial groups really want or care about. It's so obnoxious and presumptuous. So Syra Rao is an incredible grifter, and her other claim to fame is white people can pay her to come to dinner with them and to tell them that they're racist, which is like, there's a good book by a woman named Elizabeth Lash Quinn, called Race Experts. And it's just about all this weird, like racial S&M stuff that privileged liberals have been into forever that has no connection to anything but making them feel bad, which in turn makes them feel good because they want to feel bad. It's this really weird. Liam Bright is in philosophy like you, and he's a good follow on Twitter. And he's written a little or tweeted a little bit about how some of these sort of intra-elite blowups seem to be about white liberal psychodrama more than anything that's structural or material. And I think that's a useful observation.
Yeah, no, for sure. He's also Liam is both I think like a very smart guy and a very insightful guy, but also just like a like a very funny, very high level troll. Like he does things like there's this podcast called Embrace the Void, which is kind of a philosophy podcast, and on there. The host Aaron Rabinowitz will do this thing where he'll give people this like lightning round to like say like whether they think that like various like things that are like philosophically controversial, whether they're real or not are real, like free will or whatever. And when Liam was on the show, he said not real for every single thing except for God.
That's very Liam. I think someone in the chat asked for the name of the book. Maybe they're talking about something else. Race Experts by Elizabeth Lash Quinn. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. And yeah, so I saw in the same spirit, I saw Liam tweeting that he would be willing to go out to dinner with you and tell you how racist you are for only 75% of what
he was trying to undercut Syra Rao. Yeah, it was Liam's a great guy. He's very smart. And I don't know. I mean, this is one of the reasons I like you, but I like people who are ardently left, even to the left of me, but who recognize that some of the stuff going on is a little bit weird and worth pushing back against.
Yeah, and I think some of it's worth pushing back against for multiple reasons, right? Some of it is just that this is like some of these things are just bad ways to to be in the world, right? To interact with people that like the Sarah Rao stuff, like among other things, it seems like it would make it impossible for any white person who really bought into this to just have normal friendships with non-white people, which seems like a weird anti-racist goal.
Yeah.
But also a reason to push back against it is for leftist reasons, because like one thing that, like, whatever else you think about any of this, like one thing that should be obvious is that rich white women paying a lot of money to Sarah Rao to go out for a nice dinner and yell at them for being racist, doesn't actually do anything to change the balance of power or resources, between white people and black people in the United States. The only person that redistributes wealth to is Sarah Rao.
I mean, a lot of this sort of performative stuff only goes on between people sort of not in the 1%, but in the top 20%. Sarah Rao is a elite college educated type. She goes to the homes of elite college educated women who can afford this intervention, and nothing is gained. There's a rich scene of sort of grifters at the moment because white liberals did not respond to this summer's events and unrest by deciding to meaningfully change how they live or do anything more out there than try to get Joe Biden elected, but they really want to feel like they're part of the fight. And I can identify with that, having grown up in a town like that, and feeling that pull of feeling like this is a really important struggle that I'm not really a part of, and I've benefited from some of these dynamics. So it's psychologically weird, but I think you need to find a way to channel that sense of guilt into something a little bit more useful than literally paying a woman of color to come to dinner and call you racist, or paying Robin DiAngelo to come to your workplace and call you racist.
Yeah. And there is something very weird about even, this isn't the angle that I would normally use to attack this, but I mean, if we want to play this game, there is something very weird about the fact that somehow the book that sold the most copies as a sort of response to the post-George Floyd moment was a book by a white woman who does corporate trainings.
Yep. Shouldn't it raise some questions that all the rad libs who view their politics as very vanguard radical, they're saying the exact same shit that Halliburton says on its Instagram page? Shouldn't that cause you a moment of doubt and reflection? But it doesn't seem to.
Yeah, and this is there's something, and again, this is something that I think you can criticize from both angles, because on the one hand, I do think that there is something a little bit disturbing about the idea that your boss can force you while you're at work to go to a meeting where somebody comes and yells at you, and you're not allowed to push back against anything.
It's abusive. In any other context, you would call that abusive. We turn our brains off when the subject is race or other hot button issues. That's obviously abusive and horrible labor-wise, right?
Yeah, and also, again, it does nothing to actually correct the sort of the various phenomena that we're pointing to, when we use the phrase structural racism, because it's not structural, it's psychological. It's about what's going on in white people's heads, and there is often, I think, an interesting kind of dissonance sometimes in the very same people. Some of these people that you're talking about as rad libs, that some of the same people who really sort of throwing these words like structural and systemic behind everything, somehow also in practice seem to be overwhelmingly concerned with individual virtue and sort of trying to figure out what's in individual people's hearts and how they can be made more aware of what's in their hearts. So for example, something that you talk about in the book is this implicit association test, which is supposed to show you about all of your unconscious bigotry.
Yep, all the racisms you could do if you're not careful. The argument I make in the book, there's a book called Age of Fracture called Daniel Rogers, who's a really good historian. He argues that basically from the 60s or 70s on, American society got more fractured and more individualistic. And we used to understand ourselves as embedded in these complicated social and religious and civic structures. But for a variety of reasons, no more. We're all just sort of free-floating atoms these days. In his view, 9/11 sort of briefly returned us to some sense of unity and structure, but since then, no. So the argument I make in my book is that if you looked at the way we talk about race these days, you would think it is very structural. It is very people talking about systemic racism and white supremacy in the sense of not just individual attitudes, but structures, the whole Michelle Alexander thing, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, racism without racists. Then when you dig into these ideas and interventions, they're all about individuals. The implicit association test is about individuals. Microaggressions trainings are about individuals. The weird shit that popped up in the New York school system where talking about love of the written word is white supremacy. Is that your cat? Is your cat a white supremacist? What's its implicit association test score?
I don't know. I mean, he won't sit down and take it.
This stuff is all very individual. And the prevailing assumption is that if we could fix individuals and we could make them a little bit less implicitly biased and a little bit less microaggressive, it would do something. There's never a fully coherent theory of what that would do. Robin DiAngelo sort of gestures at it. She says that progressive liberals do more harm to people of color than any other group, which I find psychotic because like I think progressive white people are often condescending and weird to people of color, but right-wing state legislators are the ones who cut welfare and eviscerate public education and make sure there's no decent community colleges. I would think that would be a bigger issue. So
yeah, right. like the idea, like really, like this is I mean, that is just a remarkable claim. I mean, that's worth taking a beat on because, like, you know, if you think about all the things that you know you might talk about when you talk about, you know, you sort of gesture at this idea of systemic racism, you know, which are, you know, very often the conversation I think is probably way too limited to issues about criminal justice and mass incarceration. You know, that's one aspect of it. You know, you could also talk about, you know, racial disparities in, you know, education and healthcare and, you know, and all of that stuff. But like all of those things, right, like are things that result from, well, I mean, they result from, I would argue, the combination of America's like history of, you know, de jure racial apartheid until a few decades ago, plus the fact that you know, markets left to their own tend to preserve you know, existing distributions of wealth, and the parts that aren't, you know, so a lot of this stuff has a life of its own, and also, yeah, like, you know, right wing, so, you know, like right wing politicians, you know, cutting social services, passing, you know, increasingly harsh, you know, criminal penalties, etc. Like all of these things contribute like massively to those, and somebody who's like a well-meaning white progressive who doesn't know how to talk to people or is just weird and awkward or condescending, like, I mean, it's fine to say that's a problem. Multiple things can be problems, but to say that it's bigger than the first problem is just extremely weird.
And from my very limited experiences, like when I lived in Germany, being basically the only Jew and being in a couple of cases sort of seen as like a token or a totem, that's uncomfortable. That sucks. Yeah. I would not want to be one of the only black people in predominantly white office. But if you're in an office and you're in a corporate setting and you have a comfortable job, you're already doing better than most Americans. And it's this intense focus on elite universities and elite corporate settings. It tells you something. Again, this stuff comes back to class. And
yeah. I mean, this is the kind of point that, like, well, I mean, like if you read like Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal, you know, this is what he spends a lot of time talking about in there, is this vision of social justice, where what you really mean by social justice is basically meritocracy, where there aren't arbitrary, bigoted impediments to the best and the brightest rising to the top. That, you know, that the people who, that, you know, you can have like the kind of vision is that justice has been achieved once, you know, half of CEOs are women and 10% of them are black, and, you know, whatever the right percentages are, gay and trans, and, you know, and all of which, of course, you know, look, I mean, I do think, you know, like Michael Brooks always used to say, you know, if our choices are limited to like, you know, racially inclusive capitalism, or racially exclusionary capitalism, then yeah, go for the first one. But but also like this is a vision of what achieving justice would mean that definitionally leaves behind the vast majority of people, including, and in fact, especially the vast majority of people in the target groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And, some of that representational stuff is important. If the choice is we can not have a Black and South Asian vice president or have one, I'd much rather have one. But it is, again, the fixation on elite settings and etiquette there. A lot of the stuff is about etiquette, too. There's this assumption that there's a straight line between etiquette, and the etiquette is ever changing, and you always need more training. 5 years from now, there'll be a successor to Robin DiAngelo, and the rules will be different. If you obtain the right level of familiarity with the rules of etiquette, you're a good ally. That's very convenient because it doesn't imply that you need to ask any broader questions about the way things are structured. This is any other self-help quest that you can do from the comfort of your own, air-conditioned home, and that's what gets me about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because this is like a game that you could continue to play, forever, right? Like that you could just have, like I remember Freddie DeBoer had a really good post about this on his Substack. I think it was called "Perhaps We Can't Do Both," something like that, where it says like this is something that you could just keep this up for centuries. That you could have like. A certain kind of white person spending tons of time, talking about their admiration for the nobility of Black people, and and making a big deal about certain kinds of representation, and it's still being the case that the long-term economic effects on most Black people of the history of racial discrimination, etc., don't go anywhere, right? Yeah. Because none of this would, or even in principle, could solve it.
Yeah, I mean, you can focus. I disagree with that completely. You can focus entirely on, whether people are using the exact right words at Princeton. Princeton had a big blow up about racial justice, as though Princeton as an institution contributes anything to social mobility, as though it's not just taking the tiny subset of kids who are already from wealthy families. I just find a lot of that stuff to be disingenuous.
Yeah. I mean, like the vast majority of people who go to Princeton, Yale, places like this, come from the high end of the, of income distribution. Like you have a, small minority of them are scholarship kids, but even that, right. It doesn't just definitionally, like you can't have not every cheerleader can be standing on top of the pyramid, you can't have, not everybody can be a scholarship kid at an Ivy League school like this. This is something that's just not going to solve the problems of most people who are at the bottom of the economic, the economic structure, and it couldn't be. Right, that there couldn't be a society where everybody was upwardly mobile, because just most things that have to be done in any society, are things that are not the jobs that Princeton trains you to do. If everybody went to Princeton wouldn't be worth much. It gives you a competitive advantage in the labor market, because it's relatively rare, but ultimately. This is like a very basic thing, because this is a very common belief that in a way unites that sort of like right-wing uncle at the family barbecue who says that if people don't like getting minimum wage, they should just go back to school and they'll be fine, with people like Barack Obama. He says in one of his State of the Union addresses that the best anti-poverty program that's ever been devised is a world-class education, which is the sort of thing that rolls off the tongue. It sounds good, people clap, but what does that mean, right? Because it's it surely can't mean that everybody at the bottom of society is going to become a highly educated, well-credentialed professional, because that can't happen. If you if everybody was a middle-class professional, everybody would starve to death because nobody would be growing the food or bringing it to grocery stores or stocking it on shelves. So at a certain point, you have to either admit that you aren't really that interested in the life outcomes of people at the bottom of society, or you have to focus on something other than education.
Yeah. Can I should roll out in about 10 minutes. Can I do one other bit of derailing?
No. Go nuts. So it's the book is called The Quick Fix. It's out today. I hope that we spend a decent amount of time talking about this. So do your derailment.
Well, I mean, I saw one question in the comments about like my stuff on gender dysphoria, and I don't want to ignore that if someone has a question. So I see the question. If the person who raised that has questions, I'll check in a minute. And if they have a specific question, I'm happy to answer it here.
Yeah. So let me just say this about that, like briefly. I think that if I thought that Jesse was transphobic, I wouldn't have actually had him on the channel because like unless it was to argue with me about that, I guess. I don't think that's the case. And I think that oftentimes, like, one of the very bad things about social media is that once enough people get a certain assessment, I'm not saying you did say that, dismantled. I'm addressing a sort of broader phenomenon of the way that people.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean this in a confrontational way. I just meant if there's a genuine question, it would be silly for me to not answer it on this platform. So I didn't mean it confrontationally. We don't have to talk about that stuff at all.
No, right. So, but I think it is worth just saying a minute about, because I know that this is, in the nature of this, right? I know and knew, right? Inviting you on that I am. It's like a nomological, like, law of physics certainty, right? That I'm going to get some shit for this later, because that's the nature of the beast. That's how it works, right? I know, I know, like, you're on Useful Idiots, right? It's the Katie Halper was telling me that that she'd gotten some shit about the having you on for this reason, and I hope I'm not doing what Michael used to do to me and sort of casually dropping things on the air that, like, I was like, oh shit, I didn't think he was going to talk about that, but I think that there's some like, I think it actually maybe is worth spending just a minute on to clarify what the issue is and where it comes from, right? Since I think that on the things, like, oftentimes people hear this, they get this whiff. There's a sort of like, there's oftentimes these things snowball on social media. When the suggestion is put out there about somebody, oftentimes, frankly, I'm not saying this happens in your case, but I think there's like a really bad, like, there's a vicious cycle where somebody is accused of something and they start spending all their time pushing back against that.
I mean, earlier today you were accused of basically being Dave Rubin, so the accusations can get sort of detached from reality pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And that people being understandably upset about the accusation start spending so much time talking about it that then third-party observers who might not start out giving the accusation credence be like, wow, he spends a lot of time on this topic. Maybe
you mean by perhaps responding to random YouTube commenters and derailing the whole? You're saying that might not have been a good approach.
I'm not drawing any kind of conclusion like that, but I think, I think that like where this originally came from, it's not right. Like I've been on your show. I've listened to you for a long time. I have, never once heard you, misgender anybody. I have never heard you, express support for like laws to like outlaw like youth, medical transition. In fact, I know that you've written articles opposing that. I think that I think that you wrote a couple of articles that had that sort of had like people initially interpreting them in like kind of the worst possible light that sort of snowballed into this later impression. So do you want to spend like just a minute talking about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the articles was about a guy who who got fired from the clinic he ran in Toronto, and the clinic was shut down as a result of accusations that he was performing conversion therapy on trans youth. And I basically found that the most specific, important allegations were wrong. I investigated it, and everyone agrees they were wrong. The hospital signed a settlement and gave him a bunch of money, saying we libeled him, basically. So because people conflated the question of whether these specific accusations were right with whether his approach was the best approach. And I think it was more conservative on questions of like when kids should socially transition or when they're dysphoric enough to socially transition. That got translated via the Twitter game of telephone to me defending conversion therapy, which is sort of like saying if someone's accused of murder and then you find the evidence they committed murder lacking, you're defending murder. It's just not a normal understanding of morality and evidence.
No, right, absolutely, and I think that like there are maybe like I mean I think oftentimes like the things that I think trans activists spend the most time on typically, right? Like are like expanding anti-discrimination ordinances so you can't so you can't like fire somebody or deny them housing for being trans or things like this.
And we're getting like the big Supreme Court case last year. That was a surprise given the conservative tilt of the court, which was a very big deal.
Yeah. And I think that I think there is sometimes a phenomenon though where people who actually agree with each other about all that stuff, right? That will still say like you sort of get into these like fine-grained like issues about like how much medical and like a lot of what people got mad at you about, you're actually not advocating a position at all, right? You're just doing journalism, but you do, I think, sometimes get even when there are genuine normative arguments about things like how much medical gatekeeping is appropriate, for children at what age, where what different clinicians in different areas will ask for wildly varies across the country, and just at different clinics, different areas. And I think almost nobody actually holds the position, like outside of Twitter, maybe, right? That the right answer to this is none, right? That we should have 100% medical autonomy for very young children. Now there are people who really exist who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, who are conservatives, who think that like children just shouldn't be allowed to take hormone blockers or do things like this, which is a position that you've actually specifically like written in opposition to.
Well, this is what frustrates me is like the Arkansas law that just overcame a veto, which I think is a terrible idea. And I wrote a newsletter article a year ago explaining why these laws are a terrible idea. I should not have admitted to having that whole pro-genocide chapter. It really undercut my moral high ground. I think the fact that I do think assessment is important. This is partly because I've talked to kids who have later regretted the treatment they went through, because adolescent mental health is complicated. There's not a lot of great evidence for puberty blockers. The NHS just declared this, or their sort of research branch that looks into the systemic evidence for stuff. I'm in favor of blockers. I'm in favor of hormones. My Atlantic article had a sort of glowing profile of a kid who had a double mastectomy at 16. I still get emails from liberals who find it astounding I could be in favor of that. I'm in favor of that because I think that's the best thing to do in a case where someone has severe dysphoria that they will suffer with for the rest of their lives unless we give them access to medical care. That's why I'm very opposed to these laws, despite certain limitations in the evidence. I don't think we can always make perfect medical decisions on the basis of perfect evidence. I think a lot of people are walking around taking antidepressants that don't have perfect evidence bases behind them. So what's frustrated me on Twitter is I think the fact that so many of us are united in opposition to these laws should be a sign that they're a bad idea. Instead, I've had people literally arguing to me that I'm the reason The far-right Arkansas state legislature made this law. The Christians in Arkansas looked to the Jew in Brooklyn who wrote an article in the Atlantic, and if it weren't for that, they wouldn't have signed this anti-trans healthcare law, which I just don't think is realistic or helpful.
That you have the power to get them to do this, even though your actual stated position is opposition to it, so that they don't care that much about what you think, but they do care that you wrote this article. I think it's also worth pointing out that the fact that somebody will misleadingly or partially cite something and say that it supports their argument when it really doesn't is something that is going to happen, right? That's not you can't that's in a way there's something very strange about saying that if people that if somebody dishonestly cites something, right, that the fault lies with the work being dishonestly cited.
Well, so the most annoying example of this was a conservative group pushing for one of these laws cited me in one of their briefs. And they cited me in the context of there not being evidence that transition helps alleviate gender dysphoria. My Atlantic article. The Atlantic article, in fact, said the exact opposite. It spent hundreds of words explaining that there is evidence, not perfect evidence, but good evidence, suggesting that transition helps gender dysphoria. So by this point, I'd had experience with people on the left doing the exact same thing. But what can you do when you write something and you specifically say, I like dogs, and then someone's like, well, look at his article. He says he hates dogs. As a writer, that puts you in a sort of ridiculous position where there's just not much you can do about that. That said, if people want to say that I focus too much on the questions or on detransitioners, which is people who transition and transition back, that's a fair critique. But that's not a critique compatible with the idea that anything in my work can be fairly read to support these really ridiculous laws. I don't want fucking Joe whatever, who represents a tiny district in Arkansas, getting between a trans kid and their doctor. I think it's a fucking disaster. And we're all intelligent. We can keep in our heads two things. The evidence isn't great. We do not want far-right demagogue legislators preventing people from accessing healthcare that they can get in the rest of the country and all over Europe. I wish we could be a little bit saner about this discussion. I think it would make it easier for doesn't like dogs, people to advocate for the right positions.
Yeah, and I think that there. So I guess I'd also just very briefly say that there's that I've seen some discussion about this stuff, and I know that some of the factual details of some of these incidents, I've seen people who spent way more time than I have, on it. Have go back and forth, with in a really bitter way, right, about what's true about some of these stories and some of these details, and I don't know, right, but I think that I wouldn't claim to know. I also think that I think there are also interesting conceptual issues that I've seen raised that even if I'm not always crazy about the form in which they're raised, right? About how we should think about this sort of clinical term, gender dysphoria, and the more sort of abstract conceptual category of gender identity, and I think that those are again interesting arguments that lots of people who know more about all of this stuff than I do have made, seem very sure of themselves, right? Let's put it that way. But ultimately, in a weird way, I mean, this is kind of the same. This is sort of the equivalent for trans rights and equality of some of what we're talking about symbolic and substantive approaches to racial equality earlier. I guess I'm just much less interested in esoteric arguments about exactly how we should think about the metaphysics of gender than I am in stopping like discrimination against trans people, or
I'm so with you. I mean, some of the trans people I've had the most interesting conversations with have very heterodox views about their own gender. I like Corinna Cohn. She's like an outcast among trans people because her view of her own gender, no one else need feel that their own view of their gender is impinged upon by this. She does not view herself as like a literal woman. She thinks the concept of being a literal anything doesn't really mean anything. How do you define that except biologically? And there's such a diversity of opinion about gender and about the philosophy of it among LGBT people in general. And I love what you're getting at, which is like so much of this debate is about like chanting the right mantras and making these broad but often under evidenced metaphysical claims. What matters to me is that if someone will be helped by hormones or by surgery, they get access to it. I think that is a basic matter of rights, and it's people rarely tie this issue into the fact that we have a broken healthcare system. In Germany and Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands, there's much fewer issues with trans people getting healthcare, and that's not an accident. So that's another, I mean, this goes back to our whole conversation about how like the online discourse is just like overeducated people spouting off about nonsense that doesn't matter. I think that applies here. And I would much rather focus on just like, how can we get people the help they need? And instead it's like, oh, you dare to say that a 12-year-old might not know exactly who they are? How what a bigot. But that's stupid, and that's not really the issue here. I don't
think. Especially because most people, if you like their actual considered position, right, once you start asking a few questions, is not that the 12-year-old should have complete medical autonomy, right? They want there to be perhaps less gatekeeping. I think that there are arguments that could happen between well-intentioned people about how much is too much and what the balance is there. But I mean, certainly adults, I think outside of I'm sure we could come up with edge cases about mental illness and other things, but like I think adults should have completely unrestricted, more or less, access to to whatever they feel is right for them. But nobody. But again, that issue about whether the 12-year-old who actually is like insistent, consistent, and persistent, that has gone through some screenings, and this really does seem to be what's right for them, that they get the healthcare that they want, isn't an issue that I think is most fruitfully channeled into these sort of abstract philosophical debates about what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a woman, or what it means to be non-binary. I think it's an issue of a right to healthcare that which is something that we're very bad at in the United States at provisioning in general, and it's even worse that that we set up arbitrary obstacles to it in this case.
I agree completely. I would also just point out that some of the people who have made the most eloquent arguments against essentialist views of gender, where like you're not trans unless you consider yourself literally a woman, are trans people. Obviously, they are the in many ways the most skilled at weighing these issues and talking about them in interesting ways. So the online discourse is so stupid and so not representative, in much the same way that if you went to like Black Lives Matter Twitter, you would not find a representative view of American Black opinion. It's the same on this. It's just very different from what people care about the most. And yeah, someone asked if I'm against, I don't know if she was asking me or someone in the chat. So you think the National Health Service denying trans affirming care to trans youth is a huge problem? I do think it's a huge problem. I said so in a newsletter article. They've since there was another ruling where adults can consent on their kids' behalf to hormones and puberty blockers, which I think is something like the right policy. But yeah, just to answer that.
Yeah, and I think it is also just worth saying, I mean, this is like maybe a little trite and obvious, but like generally speaking on almost any issue, whether we're talking about like anything, right? Like how left Twitter thinks we should go about fighting for Medicare for all, and how like the nurses unions think we should go about fighting for Medicare for all are tend to be very different, right? How, and like whether we're talking about that or struggles against police violence, or struggles for trans rights and equality, oftentimes, like what people are preoccupied with on Twitter and what like the activists doing most good on these issues are preoccupied with it are just not even like speaking the same language.
Yeah. And look, yes, let's just leave it at that, because I don't want to go too down in this, but I'm glad I could answer a couple questions. Most important thing is everyone in this chat needs to buy The Quick Fix, which is my book. That's your moral imperative if you care about the rights of marginalized people. I'll just say it. I'll be blunt about it. And I think you'll agree, Ben.
Yeah, no, a lot of people claiming to be allies who have not
haven't bought my book or your book for that matter.
No, that's not. Yeah, that's even more egregious if you claim to care about anything positive. Actually, that like, I mean, I'm not even, like, there's nothing pro genocide in my book. So if you haven't pre-ordered it, I mean, I don't know. That's something for you to think about. Maybe you need to do some work.
You should sit with yourself and I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just saying, like, really, that's the hill you're going to die on, not ordering Ben's book? Rethink this, Chief. Read The Room.
Exactly. Read The Room. Buy the book. Also buy The Quick Fix. Thank you so much, Jesse.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for watching, even the people who don't like me.